R-O-S-H, okay, which means head, okay? Dean Stanley, in his, and this is Dr. McGee speaking here, Dean Stanley, in his exhaustive history of the Eastern Church, published, and this he did this in 1979. He said that was published in 50 years earlier, so the late 1920s, early 1930s. This scholar, Dean Stanley, found a note on Genesius, the great Hebrew scholar, to the effect that the word Rosh should mean Russia. Okay? So Dean Stanley adds that this is the only reference to a modern nation in the entire Old Testament. That in the entire Old Testament, Magog is pointed out, and Magog is a modern country. It is Russia. Okay? It's identified as being in the north, and we know that it is. So you have Israel right here. Okay? Moscow is straight north, just slightly to the east. But straight north is Moscow. Straight north is Russia. Okay? So is Turkey. I put that up there for this reference point. So, Dr. McGee continues, Rosh, taken on a proper name in Ezekiel, signified the inhabitants of Scythia, from whom the modern Russians derive their name. Russia was first called Muscovy, derived from Meshach. Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, came to the Muscovite throne in 1533. He assumed the title of Tsar, which was the first time the title was used. He says, I'm sure you detect the names Meshach and Tubal certainly sound like Moscow, Meshach and Moscow. And Tobolsk, which is way over in Siberia. The linguistic phenomena certainly leads us to believe that Ezekiel is talking about Russia in the passage. So it is clear here that thousands of years ago, God pointed out, Russia, you're going to rise up against Israel. So, and it can't happen unless Israel's a nation. Israel became a nation in 1948. Again, with the same language. They never lost their language. They never lost the perspective of who they were. It's the only time in the history of all countries and nations and people of the world that has happened, where it ceased to exist and then it came back. So there is that piece of this. The other thing is this that I want to point out. I think this one is really interesting. In the Ten Commandments, what did God say about having other gods? You shall have no other gods before me. Russia doesn't have any other gods. Russia is atheist. They claim there is no God because Marxism claims there is no God. Yeah, Alan.
Saying Galatians 6:7, God is not mocked. Whatsoever man sows, that's what he's going to reap.
Yep.
They're sowing their own destruction.
Yep. Well, so it wasn't until David's time that people always had a God. It just wasn't always the Almighty God. People made other things gods. And then people started to say, once in a while, they would say there is no God. And David wrote, the fool says in his heart there is no God. But Russia's platform of a nation is built on the fact there is no God. In fact, when they sent men to space, they got up in space. I find this fascinating, that they spoke back to Earth, well, we are up here, we don't see God anywhere.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, we are.
So, one of the greatest, they beat us there. Right. And they get there, and instead of saying, we're the greatest of all time, they say, yeah, we don't see God anywhere. Why? If God doesn't exist, why do you even mention it, right? Which is always a fascinating question to think about. So, take all these pieces. What do we know that the final 7 years is about? It's about God's judgment, right? God is judging the earth. So, when you get to Russia says there is no God. We're God. We know better than whatever God that you think you have. Go to Ezekiel 38, verse 4. Ezekiel 38, verse 4 says, I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with all your army, including horses and riders, who are all splendidly dressed, a huge assembly armed with large and small shields, all of them brandishing swords. I will put hooks in your jaws. I will make you come out. I'm going to pull you out of the great north where you live. I'm going to pull you down here. What is his purpose of pulling them down there? His purpose, because this is a country, this is a nation, this is a people who say there is no God. I'm going to show you there is a God. Because what do we see? He says in verse 16, you will advance against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. It will happen in the last days, Gog. I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know me when I show myself holy through you in their sight. He's bringing them to Israel to prove there is a God, and he's bringing judgment on them for saying that there is no God. Yes?
Isn't there already a considerable Russian military presence in Syria?
Yeah, I think they've
Their
used...
bases and army units, and these are some naval. So it'd just be a hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah, I mean...
Golden Heights.
Yep. The other thing, and I sent Ray a text the other day, and I said, they've got to feel pretty confident. So let's just say you go back to Revelation 6, and it opens up with chaos, right? So you've got the Antichrist coming out, and then you've got war, and Russia says, you know what? We'll bring peace. And if they're saying they can bring peace, it must mean that, again, something happens to us that we're not there to be the peacemakers. So maybe Russia, and this is just my thinking, okay? But I'm thinking there's got to be a reason. He's putting hooks in their jaws. Something in their mind is going to go, we'll take care of this. We'll come out. I'm going to put hooks in your jaws. I'm going to draw you out. I'm going to bring you down here, Russia. I'm going to put you in my land, and I'm going to wipe you out here. Because you have said all along that I don't exist, for one. Plus, he's proven to Israel that he is God. And it's in that moment that Israel goes, oh, it was God. Yeah, go ahead.
It all depends on the timing. You're right. But if this was to happen just prior to the tribulation period, Russia's army is practically wiped out.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Which leaves you with the Chinese.
Yeah. And don't worry, they're coming.
Oh, yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What does McGee or anybody say about Gog? I had a thought, but I may be...
So McGee says Gog is a dictator. So he's saying Gog and Magog. So Gog is the leader of Magog, the dictator of Magog is what McGee is saying.
Okay. In the book of Daniel, it talks about the prince of Persia coming up and stopping this angel that's bringing a message to Daniel.
Yes.
Well, this says Gog, land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I was thinking spiritual warfare. Is this actually, Gog is actually a demonic who is manipulating Russia? I don't know.
Could be. I mean, it could be. Yeah.
Satan's got his demons all over the place, working with leaders,
Yes.
influencing them. Of course, they do God's bidding and don't even realize it.
Right. That's right. And we'll see that again as we go.
I wondered what he said.
So Gog is the word for, it means head or dictator, is the way he put it.
Okay.
Is the way he put it.
Gog is?
Gog.
Okay, what's Rush?
So is the there's I think the King James uses Rosh as the word, but it's also Meshach and Tubal here. Where was it?
No, I thought you said that meant head.
Gog means head. Magog is the land of the.
Okay, what does you didn't say before that Rosh
is
means
Russia.
Head?
No, Gog means head. And Magog is Rosh, and Gog is the leader of Magog.
Okay.
is what
The
McGee
reason I
says.
said that is because I'm not sure you can put Gog and fasten it to a man, because Gog comes up later. At, where is it, at the end of the tribulation period? Or, no, when Satan is released again at the end of the millennial reign, is it? Someplace,
yes,
Gog
yeah.
comes up again.
And so that was the first time McGee's the first one I've ever heard define it like that. So,
Doesn't it?
but yes, of Gog I'm talking about.
Yeah, but Gog comes up again in Revelation somewhere.
Yes.
Is it when Satan's released at the end of the, no? Maybe I'm all the way, help me out here. I think it does.
I think that's right.
Yeah, at the end.
Let me see
So
if I
that's
find-
why I was thinking, maybe this is demonic influence. I don't know.
Well, there's definitely some demonic influence
Yeah.
in it. Let me see if I can find something for you real quick. Hold on here.
I didn't mean to get you off track.
I'm gonna have to take a pass, and I'll circle back around and find that for you.
I have a little subtitle in mine that says about Gog and Magog. It says, "Who are Gog and Magog?" The Bible interpreters disagree. So
Yeah.
the Bible interpreters
Yeah.
disagree on exactly
Right.
who they exactly are.
Other,
But it,
yeah.
but it says at the very least they represent an evil empire that attacked Israel from the north.
Yeah, yeah. And I think now it is clear that it is it is the Russians. So grab this one right here, and I'll shift over to this. This was written by Joel Rosenberg, Joel C. Rosenberg, as he is known on his novels, and he writes modern novels that have been very, very popular. I've never read one because I'm not a novel guy. But he's also a Messianic Jew. And did you find it? Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
This is in Revelation 20. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle.
Okay. All right.
So,
I still need to circle back around for you on
Yeah.
that one. But that's... So I'm not going to go point by point on this. There's some highlight things here, because I think it is fascinating that the Bible points out some national alliances that rise up against Israel all these thousands of years ago, and we see these alliances right before our eyes. That being Russia, Syria, Turkey. Also, and I wrote up here that you can see Iran. Germany is noted as Gomer in there. The Sudan, a couple versions of the Bible read Ethiopia, but when you look at that, and and Rosenberg says here that is more likely Cush, which is a highly Islamic area. And that's the other thing that he brings up, is that what the Bible didn't see then, but this alliance is held together by Islam. You know, there's a lot of these countries are Islamic, and by some counts, Russia is 20% Islamic in their people. So Sudan, Libya, and Syria, and Lebanon are all part of this alliance. And it says many peoples, because down here it says, you and your whole assembly in verse 7 of chapter 38. You know, so it's Russia, those ones that are identified, and a whole host of nations that will rise up and say, you know, like they tried to do in, what was it, 1967? They were just going to push Israel into the sea. And Israel rose up and they took them all out, you know. And so that's what they're going to try to do again. Yeah.
Question, you've got certain Muslim nations, you've got Sunnis and Shiites, and they hate each other just as much as they hate you had the Iran-Iraq war. That's going to have to, in some way, they'll have to come to an understanding.
Yeah.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah, that's the first thought I had too, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I also I had a question here that I wrote down. I'm looking back at these pages, which I'm just a little bit, I'll bring it up later, but I want to ask it now. The question is this: if Islam, as we understand it right now, is intolerant of Christians and Israel and Jews in general, how is the Antichrist ever going to be able to make a covenant to allow the Jews to worship in the temple? You know? Because that's going to have to be on the Temple Mount. This is a little bit of sidebar here, but that will happen after this war. But at some point, this so slick talking, or so something or other, will the Antichrist be that he's going to be able to get people who hate each other to sit down at a table and say, okay, yeah, we'll do that. Or begrudgingly do it, but whatever happens, it'll happen, at least for a short period of time. So, you know, how crazy it'll be. And if this war happens first, and it will, it has to. It can't happen any later in the tribulation period and still be the 7 years that it says is going to happen here. So if that happens first, you know, a lot of things change. Also, you've got 25% of the population of the earth, a quarter of the earth, wiped out, or dead. You know, so I think people may be more willing to sit down and say, yeah, we got to have something. Somebody's got to help us, you know. Who had a hand up? Did you have a hand up?
I got a question, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna save it for the end because it's got nothing to do.
Okay. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that.
I think he's going to convince them that it's to their advantage. Because look at Russia now. I just read it someplace, I think it was Rosenberg or somebody. But a good friend of mine was in the military. He said Russia really wants a warm water port.
Yeah.
They got it.
Because their ships get locked in with ice all the
Oh,
time.
they do.
So it's to their advantage to wipe out Israel. You know, yeah, we'll go together. We'll take Israel out if we can have a warm water port in the Mediterranean or something. You know, that's how it's all going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And McGee pointed that out, and that was 40 years ago. It's 1979 is the part that you see in there, and he recorded that. That was 1979.
Yeah.
He said the other day. So that was 40 years ago. Russia was looking for that. You know.
One of the biggest influx of dollars and refurbishing the churches in Israel has been coming from Russia.
Really?
The Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox churches, they've been built, and if you go into one, they're very ornate. They don't have any of the statues or anything, but they have icons painted, and a lot of gold leaf. And I was told that most of the money going into the rebuilding of these Russian Orthodox churches in Israel was Russian.
Isn't
Coming out
that
of
fascinating?
Russia.
That's
Now,
fascinating.
why? I don't know, but
How do they get away with if they're not allowed to have religion?
well, since the fall of the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
the Russian Orthodox Church has really thrived. It's
Oh, really?
it's really jumped up in popularity. It's like any other country. There's always been believers of Christian believers within those countries, and that's why you run into some of those influxes, like in Armenia and Azerbaijan. You have a lot of conflict there between Russians and Muslims, but they do tolerate it to a certain extent.
It's very interesting. Very interesting.
And now, you had another question. You said Germany was Gomer, but down
Yep.
here Gomer says you say Gomer's Turkey.
So yeah, and there's some differences there. So Rosenberg notes it as that, but every other place I've seen it, and McGee pointed it out as Germany being Gomer. So Germany fits because it's from the north in some kind of alliance. And if you think back, 3 years ago or so, Germany was, President Trump said he was on Germany because they were buying a lot of their gas and stuff from the Russians.
Right.
So there was some kind of connection there that I had no idea, you know, instead of buying from NATO countries. So that was interesting. So there is a connection there of some stripe. And Germany's about to get a new chancellor later this year.
Yes.
Really?
Merkel said she was not gonna run again.
Wow.
Yeah. And that I just read about him today, as a matter of fact, and all my lesson prep comes to me. And it said that he's very soft on China.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Oh, boy.
So that's fascinating too. And Russia has let a ton of Islamic immigrants in, so they have been populated heavily.
Well, Germany is also one of the first countries that allowed Islamic Muslim immigrants, to migrate in,
Yeah.
especially out of Syria.
Yeah. Yeah.
To the point where they were shutting the doors to them.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
was just too many of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other question, all of this study, it obviously points towards Russia and Syria and
Turkey.
those
And
Turkey.
Iran.
But it talks when I've read pieces about the Antichrist, it points that he will be coming from a European nation.
Correct.
And that he will come together, basically the old Holy Roman Empire.
Correct.
How do those fit? How does that fit in with Russia and that invasion?
Well, if this happens, or because I think it does happen at the beginning, so you've got the Antichrist revealed in Revelation 6 coming out on his horse. Then you have wars, the red horse's wars. If this is part of that, if the red horse and the war against, and if Russia's wiped out,
Yeah.
then
Mhm.
the Antichrist then puts together this European connection. And think about this, if the United States is connected to that and Russia's wiped out, all of their weapons are wiped out, where are they going to get weapons? Well, they can get them from us because we're connected back to that European connection, right? So we've got a store of weapons that the Antichrist could use.
Which makes sense, because the center of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries was kind of northern France, southwestern Germany, which individually became the Habsburg dynasty, which is out of Germany.
Okay.
But if this is all happening after the rapture, no, we're not going to get to see it.
We're not going to see it.
Thank you.
I think I think we get to
I
watch.
don't have much of it right anyway.
All of this is purely human speculation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's all speculation.
There's certainly a certain amount of it that we don't know. Timing, no man knows the hour of the day,
Right.
and kind of how this pieces together. But we can see for sure the surety of it unfolding. We see both the corroboration of the Old Testament and the New Testament and Revelation, coming together. And then there are some certainties. If we know the Roman Empire, and we'll see this, Bray, you talked about a demonic connection here, and when we get into the 10 horns and that 10 nation, the 10 toes, Daniel's 10 toes, we know that's a certainty. And we can identify, just like we can identify Russia out of this, we can identify those areas that were the 10 original Roman countries, from which we can say, okay, well, we know that's what this is. So we can do that. But how all that comes back together, I'm not sure we get it totally, but there are some things I think that we can
Because
corroborate here,
There's some things that I'm sorry.
no, I was just because Great Britain and France and Spain were major countries within that Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So, if you counted the countries around the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean Sea, would we come up with 10 or maybe 13, because the 3 horns go back to 1?
Right. So, and we'll get into that before too long on that. But and I think that excuse me, there's some things that we can see even more clearly now than maybe even a few years ago on that. One thing here too that in past times people would say, "Oh, Israel has peace," but Rosenberg points out on the third page in item number 15. It said on that Rosenberg points out it should be noted that Ezekiel does not describe Israel as having peace. Rather, Israel is described as living securely in the land. What's that?
Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome. You know, they have probably the most efficient army and military on the face of the planet. They have probably the most together Israel Defense, you know, IDF, is that what that is?
Yeah.
You know, it's probably the most well-oiled
Intelligence
machine.
gathering is pretty good too.
Yes, yes. And, you know, you hear these things that have happened in Iran that they've been some nuclear setbacks for Iran, and it's Israel that has done that. And, you know, it'll come out a little week or two later, yeah, we might have done that. You know?
Still trying to figure out who sunk Iran's new battleship.
Yeah, yeah. So, and so Israel is not going to go soft on Iran, even if we do, you know. And I'm not trying to get into the politics of it, but biblically, from that standpoint, you cannot take out of this. The United States is not anywhere in here, which, if we were, none of this could happen, at least in the United States that we know. So,
It's changing fast.
yeah, very fast. And it's you look at this and you go, I mean, even when we were young people, I mean, you go back 40 years and you go, there's no way we'll ever turn our back on Israel. You know, you just couldn't see it. But now you can see that might happen, you know, shortly. Yes.
And politically, without mentioning any names, thinking from Iran and Russia's viewpoint, they're thinking maybe pressure's on because the U.S. could change
Mm-hmm.
and it could go back, you know, they could be, you know, so anyway, that I think is really advancing things.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
bring it together.
Let me lay something on you again. This is a little bit political, but I have gotten to a place I try to not look at any of this without a biblical view as best as I can understand it.
Yeah.
And in the book of Acts, I forget who it was that said it, but they were trying to shut down Christianity. And he said, if God opened that door, you're never going to shut it. Right? If God's doing this, you'll never stop it. Mm-hmm. And to that point, I think we are at a place in history, and we're at a place in time, and we're at a place in our country that if this is what's happening, and I'm not trying to be negative, I'm just saying, if this is what's happening, and we're getting close to this, there isn't going to be any more America first.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I don't see how it could happen. Because God is bringing about His plan. Now, as much as I want there to be goodness in our country, there may come a day when it does cost us to be believers.
But it does what?
Costs us to be believers.
Yes.
As this comes about, if America disappears from that standpoint, it's going to cost us something to say, I believe in Jesus Christ.
Yes.
They're not gonna say, well, isn't that nice?
I think it's gonna come to the point where they say, yes, and you're part of the reason we're in the position we're in, and it's your fault.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
comes the cost right there.
Yeah.
I think I could see that happen.
Yep. Yep. You saw the news out east in Virginia, a school board meeting ended up in chaos.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, man.
What was that?
There's a school board meeting that ended up in chaos, you know,
Sure,
last night.
Police wrestling a guy to the floor.
Yeah. And if it's coming to that because there are people who stand in and say this, well, this is what we believe, and people are so, the other side is not, there's no place for conversation. And I think these people, particularly the Marxists people, have proven they don't want to talk.
No.
They don't want to talk. They don't want to hear what God has to say.
No.
To the point that probably if this were to continue and America disappears like it looks like it's going to, and there isn't anybody that's going to say, oh yes, let's sit down and hear what God has to say. They're going to say, oh, we don't want to hear what God has to say. In fact, we don't want you even to say it. And it's going to cost us something to believe. Anyway, so I wrestle with that a little bit in my own mind. That's just my own mind. Okay, I'm not telling you you have to believe it. I'm just telling you in my own mind, I'm thinking there might not ever be that place again.
Right.
We might have been transported to a new place, But what doesn't change, if that's the truth, what doesn't change? Well, what doesn't change? You tell me. What doesn't change even if that's where we have to live in the future?
God doesn't change.
Right? Exactly. What else doesn't change?
Our purpose.
Exactly. Go into all the world. Teach the gospel. Preach the gospel. Baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. That's right. Time is short. To that point, Rosenberg puts something fascinating in here. And to prove that he is a Messianic Jew who means good, he writes in points 16 down through 19, he says something here. And he's talking about what we just saw in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and that all of these nations that are identified as existing on the planet right now, these Muslim nations, are going to be wiped out. The book of Ezekiel says they're going to be wiped out. So point 16, he says this: I recognize that these verses will be difficult for some Palestinian Arabs and some Israeli Arabs to read, whether they are born-again Christians or nominal Christians, raised in churches but without personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and especially if they are Muslims. The Bible indicates that Jews will be a sinful people when they are brought back into the land. Only after they return, the Bible teaches, will the Holy Spirit be poured out on the Jewish people in an increasingly significant way. Ezekiel 38:29 we just read, Joel chapter 2, and Joel 3 in the Hebrew Bible. Then a growing number of Jewish people will repent and return to a personal relationship with the Lord. Meanwhile, Jesus said in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, there would be wars and rumors of wars and revolutions and lawlessness in the last days. Certainly, the rebirth of Israel, while prophetic and God-ordained, has come with wars, rumors of wars, revolutions, sins, and even crimes committed by some Arabs as well as some Jews. The Bible doesn't teach this period of the last days will be easy, and the Bible is right. And then jump down to 19. Those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ need to teach sound Bible doctrine regarding Israel and the Palestinians. We need to love both, bless both, pray for both. Moreover, we need to stand with and encourage our brothers and sisters in the Messiah, whether they are Jewish or Arab. The Bible gives us no freedom to ignore or deny or oppose our brothers and sisters on either side. Rather, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers in Matthew 5:9. We need to be proactively building relationships with Israelis and Palestinians and being ambassadors of Christ and agents of reconciliation whenever and wherever possible. And I think that's the point. I think all of this information about the end times that we're looking at should help us and push us to tell others this is really going to happen. Create the conversations to say, Jesus wants relationship with you. There is good news because you can be with the Father forever. The bad news of the gospel is, unless you accept Christ as Savior and Lord, you will be separated from God forever. That is our message. And I think that's the focus of taking all this and saying, you know what, you see all this happening around us? That was all prophesied in the Bible. Whenever we see something like this that says, anything that says Russia, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, we should go, you know what, that's in the Bible. Did you know that's in the Bible? And then start a conversation with it. That leads back to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.